Hey there, really glad you dropped by. And today we usually do a Q&A, and I keep getting the question of what are toxic systems really? So I thought we would take some time today to really go through that, and it prompted me also to write a piece on toxic systems. So I may be reading a bit in this video from, what I've researched and what I've written. Um, Toxic systems I could relate to as it regarded ancestral lines and lineage. That's why I did write the book Toxic Family, Transforming Childhood Trauma into Adult Freedom, which is out on Amazon, I think, Barnes and Noble, all the normal places. It's really the story of my own trajectory here on earth. But having published that book and talked about it for a long while, it became more than evident that it was more than ancestral toxic systems that we were facing as a global human collective here on earth. It became very evident that the toxicity ranged from, I'll speak for myself, my education, which in some ways really isn't education. It's more a schooling. I don't know about you, but I felt like from fifth grade on, I was memorizing the same stuff and it didn't really feel helpful. And it didn't really move me forward as a human being. It didn't even touch my spiritual side, nor did my religious upbringing really delve me deep into my spiritual side. It was sort of a patriarchal, systematic mode of control. And a lot of you have heard me talk about staring the preacher down from the pew while he was in the middle of the sermon because he was telling me I needed a broker to talk to God. And I knew intuitively, I knew that was so wrong. There was something really wrong about that. But what happened to me is not just from my ancestral toxicity or my religious toxicity, my schooling, also the healthcare system, the financial system as I became an adult, the workplace. Gosh, yeah, I couldn't even engage in the corporate arena really, other than a stint at a very large global talent agency and then at Fox. I couldn't even figure it out. But what happened is I became ingrained and entranced and entrained to malignant and toxic systems that I sort of stopped thinking for myself. And I just wanted to go along with the programming and let someone else figure it out. And I didn't really take ownership of my thoughts and what I felt. And it was all about just getting through the day. And my central nervous system and the trauma started to take over. And I was repeatedly acting out the trauma, replicating the trauma I had experienced as a child through my own addiction, which I addressed at 25, through my own clinical depression, which I had a 10-year bout with, until I learned how to work with it from a natural point of view and happenstance. And then ultimately, narcissistic abuse and how to move through that as a sovereign being and to understand the power within me. So, the question is recognizing the characteristics of toxic systems and how do we recognize them when we've almost been trained into this trance-like state. At least I have. So I will try to speak for myself. I will continue to try to speak for myself today. So toxic systems are characterized by behaviors, practices, and structures that create control, dysfunction, harm, and often dominance. And they cost you your individual freedom, your authenticity, and your well being. And in my opinion, that's what we have been facing. And that's what we are awakening from, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And again, many of you aren't even aware that you're experiencing or you're involved in supporting toxic systems within your ancestral lines, through your education, through your workplace, in your religious structures, via your cultural programming, your healthcare systems, certainly your governments and your societal institutions. So I think we'd stop down and take some time to really look at some of the defining characteristics of a toxic system, as well as how they affect us. Um, and the first characteristic is usually an imbalance of power. So oftentimes there's a centralized method of control or authority who disempowers the individual. Oftentimes it's a father figure, and then we project that father figure of our home life or our religious system or onto our educators, onto our bosses, onto our governing bodies. And these systems are the ones that benefit, and they only benefit a select few while repressing and exploiting others. And I have a feeling that most of you listening can relate in some way to an imbalance of power. The second characteristic is fear and dependency. So there's a need for an individual to feel dependent on the malignant toxic system for either survival or success. And that's why so many of us literally pledge allegiance to these systems, because it's from a place of fear and certainly codependency. Um, Tools like gaslighting, to manipulate using psychological methods or into questioning one's own power or reason or sanity are often utilized, along with fear of failure, rejection, punishment, ostracism, all to maintain malignant control. And it's very, very painful to wake up and out. And if you're like me, you probably have woken up repeatedly, but gone back into it because you were so afraid of the abandonment or what the future would bring. And you became so dependent that you gave your allegiance. And I feel now it's getting to the point where your back is up against the wall and you're almost not given a choice, but there's a need to wake up to your role in playing out this malignant dependency. The third is a clouded transparency. So the information is manipulated, it's withheld, it's distorted to assert dominance, while critical decisions or processes are hidden from those of us affected. And I believe that we are seeing that on a global range, certainly within our governmental systems. I don't think there's any way that you could deny that is not becoming more clear, that we have lived in a shroud, and non-transparency, that we have been controlled by sort of a narrative that hasn't been direct, and that often is a sign that you are in a toxic system. So authenticity is severed. So conformity to the toxic system is applauded and rewarded, but the individuality and dissent is punished, and people are pressured to fit into predefined roles or identities to be accepted or successful. And I know you can relate. You probably have your own examples of this from the workplace, or when you may have had the courage, if you had the courage, to really authentically express your opinion in a place where it wasn't appreciated. And you probably shut that up and bottled it, never to try it again. But This is cutting off the authentic you, your own being, which is a magnificent, glorious, pure voice. And I wish our voice was more applauded than it was repressed. But I think we're going to head into a place where we'll be applauding the authenticity of ourselves and the authenticity of others. There are cycles of exploitation and abuse within toxic systems. There's never an equal or adequate return of resources or a benefit to the individual in cycles of exploitation and abuse. Your time, your energy, your money, your emotions, they're not actually honored. And in some cases, are not yours, that your time, your energy, your creativity, your glory, it gets owned by the abusers. And I see that for myself in the narcissistic paradigm that's become so prevalent and revealed in the last several years. I mean, that's a direct patterning of the cycle of exploitation and abuse. And I think that it doesn't take much to copy that over and see it within our corporate structures, as well as many other systems that we've been trained to rely on, but maybe weren't the best for our own benefit of humanity. And then change is blocked. So change agents, challengers, people that see outside the box, we're ridiculed, we're marginalized, and sometimes we're even punished. And traditions, rules, and practices are held with such rigidity that they siphon off any chance of change, of evolution, of creativity. It's the status quo or bust because you're afraid you're not going to survive otherwise within a toxic system. And then there's the psychological or emotional harm. So those of you involved in toxic systems often feel drained. You're dehumanized. You're an automaton. You're disempowered. You're going along with the status quo, even that's not what you believe. Um, and these toxic systems normalize the guilt and the shame that you are feeling inside, and it creates anxiety. And all of this is a mechanism of control. The conditioning and indoctrination is exquisitely painful too. These rituals are created and they're repeated. The messaging is repeated. It's used in media quite clearly. I'm sure you all relate. And that can even be in the alternative media. I mean, we need our own discernment, loud and clear. It is time. It no longer can we lay back and just go along with the flow. So conditioning and indoctrination programs us. So we have difficulty waking up and out of these toxic systems. And then once we wake up and out, it's hard to really keep the analysis clean and get out for real. And then there's the intergenerational hand-me-down. I'm sure you're not alone. Like, I had a very similar marriage that my paternal grandmother had. You know, I used to watch her at the shore house she had in the summer. It was like an Airbnb before Airbnbs were around. And she was hustling and moving at, 90 miles an hour while her husband was like down at the beach feeding the seagulls, having a good time. And she was the one carrying the weight. And I replicated that. We have this ancestral, intergenerational scenario that keeps replaying until we wake up and notice it and say, yeah, no, we inherit these patternings and these toxicities, and in our family lines, in our ancestral lines. And these harmful patterns and beliefs, they're handed down, completely reinforcing toxic system protocols over time. I mean, how many have a sibling that's acting out some of your parents' toxicity? Think about it. Most of us don't have to go back too far to really see it replicated and replicated in our own progeny and offspring. So defiance is punished and compliance is rewarded. So nonconformity is met with a loss of resources, retaliation, or exclusion. And you can see this being discussed about a social crediting system, something that ties our digital IDs to resources, and retaliation if you don't comply with what is expected. And this compliance is incentivized by privileges of safety and of receiving acceptance. And it's all about disempowering you to become compliant to the toxic system. You know, it's not a good thing. It's giving up our sovereignty, and we don't even recognize it because we're so hypnotized into the system. And that is why it is so important and necessary to wake up and to take responsibility. You know, I did not expect remuneration from the toxic spouse I was engaged with. I knew that was a lost cause. The best thing I could do was to walk. And at one point, I was ready to walk with the clothes on my back. And it was terrifying. It was really hard to face that fear of abandonment and what would happen. But I had to step up to it, or I would have stayed in that system and detonated. And that's the same thing that we're being faced with on the globe today, to wake up to this compliance that's rewarded and to be careful. I mean, after so many years of just saying yes and going with the program, I ask questions about everything now. I didn't feel entitled to ask questions. I didn't really want to take the time. As you know, my intuition would be screaming and just shove her voice under the carpet. I don't do that any longer. That's precious commodity to me now. And I've gotten to a much better place as a result. It's certainly not the easier, softer way it seems at first, but it's the road to freedom. And then the last characteristic that I wrote about was on isolation and disconnection. So the toxic system fosters a disconnection from your natural self, from nature. You come to rely on the sterility of technology and push away community. So you're prevented from a real unity and a shared resistance, while isolation keeps you trapped and aligned with the toxic system. And I think for me, this really played out when we were to shelter in place during the pandemic. Back and review that, there's a lot of questions I have about that experience. So really, whether your toxic system is at work, at school, in your yoga studio, in your relationships, at home, awakening to these dynamics is the first step towards reclaiming your inner power and dismantling the harmful structure to return to your self-love, your self-care, and your natural wisdom and ability to clearly discern your inner voice of intuition and your authentic power. And that's what helps you step out of this toxic system and become sovereign and lead a life of freedom. So if you'd like a more nurtured and grounding, clear way to make your choices and be more connected, living with less frustration and in balance, then consider scheduling a complimentary grounded activation with me if you've not already sampled one. And I'll leave the link to the grounded activation in the show notes. And you will feel more connected with your intuition. You'll feel more grounded, like the title of the session says, and you'll have more discernment because it is imperative. Our world, our landscape is changing, and you need your sovereign self to navigate the road that is not just coming, the road that is here. And it's an exciting time. It's a time to become the real you, that one that you know you are, that you've been missing. They're about to come back. So don't hesitate to take me up on that session. I'm really appreciative that you tuned in today. And if this video helped, please share it with someone else who might be helped. And like and comment below. I'm happy to respond to your comments. And remember, we are in this together. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Take good care.